let's get started with the animating for the user. And the reason why animating for the user is important is because animation is actually a very dear topic to a lot of us designers, but in a way we're kind of left alone in figuring out when to do it, how to do it, why to do it, right? And that's why we thought that it would be actually a good opportunity to sort of deep dive into it a little bit and sort of hopefully provide a bit of value to all of you. So the first part will be the 3 parts about animation. So we'll dissect it and sort of show a little bit what we think is included here. Then we'll go through a bit of a brief history. We'll talk then about why emotion is relevant, and then we'll go to when to do it and conclude with that. So if we look at, I'm still getting used to this, I'm not sure which one it is. So if we look at animation, sort of the topic in general, there's basically 3 main components to it. There's the execution component, which is the how, right? So you go to school and you study how to use timelines and After Effects and Framer.js and how to code to create animations and whatnot, right? Then there's the personality piece, like the who. Who is that animation we're creating or that motion we're creating? And then at the end there's the why, right? And or the purpose, which is why animation exists in the first place, or motion. And what we're going to focus on today is going to be the why, because we believe that this is the part that's actually spoken about the least. And before we deep dive into the why, let's first start with a sort of brief look at history. So how did animation came to be? How did we end up where we ended up today? So who remembers this dial-up module? Right, so
young people.
So this is probably like the very, very first beginnings of the internet, somewhere around 93, 94. And what we notice here, I'll get this right eventually, is that even there, right, in the very early stages, we did see some form of animation. Right, it must have been relevant enough for the developer back then to go through the trouble and sort of figure out how to animate these 4 dots. But let's take a step further back, because it didn't all start that smooth and that straightforward. Oh, God damn. This thing is like a mouse and the thing at the same time. So how do you...
The right, the side.
The side one?
Yeah, the down part.
Oh, God damn. No. Because it like... Oh, I can do mouse stuff with this. So anyhow, let's try... Oh, off. No. So there we go. So this is one of Microsoft's very early GUIs, right? That sort of, I think that was even before that there was connection to the internet. That was Apple's first website, or one of its first versions of its website. Imagine that. That's W3C School, right? That was their first website. This is Google. And this is Solitaire, a widely used game back then. And in all these examples, there was still 0 animation. Literally, the damn things did not move a pixel, right? Now we go a little further into the mid-90s, and all of a sudden we've got an explosion of the GIF. So the GIF, even though it was created in '87, somewhere in '93 or '94, it sort of added this feature where you can actually animate the GIF. And people went crazy, right? So that must be an indication of sort of the craving people had to just add motion to their products, to their websites. And then a little later, in the late 90s, we started seeing the huge boom of Flash, which was consuming a ridiculous amount of battery and computer power, but still relevant because people wanted to see things moving. And it was really big in media and music, and in gaming especially. And then after that came
Almost there.
Came CSS. And even though CSS actually existed already in the mid 90s, it was only it was only popularized in the early 2000s when sort of people realized that, oh God, we can actually do stuff with this and animate, and it requires so much less power than Flash. And that's when actually Apple also decided, well, we don't like Flash anymore. And a few years later, Flash died, basically. And then fast forward to Lottie, you know, we went through jQuery and JavaScript and HTML5 and CSS3 and all of those great frameworks, and then we still didn't have something really good for apps, especially Android, iOS, and then React Native. And so Lottie was born, which is sort of an in-house project from Airbnb, and they enabled you to take After Effects, like advanced After Effects animations, and actually export them as JSON in vector format, which then were able to be integrated into native apps. And they actually look exactly like you wanted them to be animated. And sort of this is more or less the cutting edge of animation and motion as we speak right now. But why? Why is everybody sort of all of a sudden rushing to animate things? So I think it's there's a really good example here from, I can't remember his name, but we'll just go through the video, and he's a neuroscientist, and we'll see what kind of conclusion he's drawn to motion and what motion and movement means to us humans. Oh, is this one on my computer?
I'm a neuroscientist, and in neuroscience we have to deal with many difficult questions about the brain. But I want to start with the easiest question, and the question you really should all ask yourself at some point in your life, because it's a fundamental question if we want to understand brain function. And that is, why do we and other animals have brains? Not all species on our planet have brains, so if we want to know what the brain is for, let's think about why we evolved one. Now, you may reason that we have one to perceive the world or to think, and that's completely wrong. If you think about this question for any length of time, it's blindingly obvious why we have a brain. We have a brain for one reason and one reason only, and that's to produce adaptable and complex movements. There is no other reason to have a brain. Think about it. Movement is the only way you have of affecting the world around you. That's not quite true. There's one other way, and that's through sweating. But apart from that, everything else goes through contractions of muscles. So think about communication. Speech, gestures, writing, sign language. They're all mediated through contractions of your muscles. So it's really important to remember that sensory, memory, and cognitive processes are all important, but they're only important to either drive or suppress future movements. There can be no evolutionary advantage to laying down memories of childhood or perceiving the colour of a rose if it doesn't affect the way you're going to move later in life. Now, for those who don't believe this argument, we have trees and grass on our planet without the brain, but the clinching evidence is this animal here, the humble sea squirt. Rudimentary animal, has a nervous system, swims around in the ocean in its juvenile life, and on some point in its life it implants on a rock, and the first thing it does in implanting on that rock, which it never leaves, is to digest its own brain and nervous system for food. So once you don't need to move, you don't need the luxury of that brain. And this animal is often taken as an analogy to what happens in universities when professors get tenure. But that's a different issue.
So really interesting stuff. I mean, if we think about it, that we really only have a brain to move, it actually goes back to thousands of years ago, right? Think about that first Homo sapien standing in front of a big bush in which there's movement, and that movement's coming towards that Homo sapien. The Homo sapien that actually was fast enough to flee and run away probably had the chance to reproduce and pass their genes on to the next generation, which also reinforced that pattern that when you see movement coming towards you fast and it's a forest and it's dark, run away. Whereas the one that actually didn't get a chance to run away for any reason, didn't get a chance to reproduce and pass on their genes. So the gene of movement and all of its different sort of ornaments is really fundamental to our DNA, to how we are as humans. So, this is really not helping me today. But why? No, hold on. Just like a parrot here. Alright. So movement helps us understand the world around us. It defines a relationship between the elements that surround us and the purpose these elements have. So, when motion creates purpose, that's when it becomes useful. So what we want to talk about today is, when does motion create purpose? So how do we figure this out? So the first thing we want to talk about is focus. And let's deep dive straight into this example. But first, let's just a quick note here is that today, nowadays in products, we're just bombarded by so many different things on the same interface that it's kind of hard to know where we should be looking unless we have a very clear intention. We're looking for something, right? So when motion creates focus. Let's look at this example from Packwire. So the screen is quite loaded actually. There's a lot going on it. But what is the first thing your eye goes to? Arrow. The arrow at the bottom of the screen, right? Why? Because it's moving. There's so many other things around it on that screen that are so much more appealing. But the first thing our eyes go to is the movement, right? And that drives focus, right? In this example, if the UX designers wanted to make sure the user knows that you can scroll down, it's a good thing that they have this arrow here, because they're going to fulfill their purpose. Let's look at this example here. So what we're trying to do here, this is on Holidu, we're trying to get the user to understand that when they like a heart, they need to know where they're going to be able to find, like a property, where they're going to find that property, that item. Is that me or is that the animation? So in this case, we make a tooltip appear in the top right corner as soon as you do this action to make sure you understand that your favorites are going to be saved up there. Very basic stuff, right? But that's where your eyes are going to go. And that's why you're going to know where your favorites are going to be saved. Another purpose that we can fulfill is guidance and teaching. If you look at this example, pretty classic one, you've probably all seen it before. What the user wants to do here is add something to their cart. Now, how simple is that? The cart, the button, actually becomes a bubble which has the same shape as the cart and just moves up there. There's nothing fancy about it, nothing really pretty, but you can bet that the users are going to know exactly how to get to their cart. This is another example that's sort of really intuitive in terms of understanding what you're completing and if you're completing it right. So it's giving you direct feedback as to what it is you're entering on a sort of credit card mock-up. So you're never going to enter your name when you're supposed to be entering the number or the CVV code or whatever that is. This is another example from Holidu, and in that case, when the user likes or goes to Uncle Herbert's property here, as soon as he, let me play it again. As soon as he opens it, what we want the user to know here is that, I'm not sure what's happening, is that this property is actually quite popular. So we first put everything into play, and that is from a live Android app, or iOS, I'm not sure. The user will end up going, the attention of the user will end up going straight here, because they've already seen this information. So the next thing they need to see is that, hey, this is a good choice you're doing. I need a new one of those. Now we can also serve the purpose of feedback, right? To give a direct response to the user about what's going on. And this is a pretty classic example. That's Twitter, right? When you like somebody's post on Twitter or somebody's tweets, that's the heart you get on the app at least. And this is letting you know that you've actually pressed the heart, right? How many of us here have been on any kind of platform and have clicked on something and just didn't get feedback, and you kept clicking on it, and then it ended up backtracking you like 8 screens because you clicked on it 8 times and it didn't tell you anything. right? This is another example as well from the platform. And in this case, the user is going to select dates. And once they select dates, we want to let them know, hey, are they available? Are they not available? So again, a little spinner and then a little check mark. Sort of it's very obvious, right, that your dates are actually available and that you can go ahead and book that property. This is another example of also, it's pretty critical actually, part of the user journey, where you want the user sort of understand when they're booking, is it working? Right, so this feeling of getting like immediate feedback, especially when it's really fast in real time, sort of gives you a feeling of satisfaction that that your action has actually been taken into account and is actually being applied. And once you've figured out sort of all of your low-hanging fruits and you've fixed a lot of the basic stuff, then you can start looking into creating delightful experiences. And this is a really cool example from Chipmunk, or what's
MailChimp.
MailChimp. Chipmunk. From MailChimp. And I mean, how basic is that, right? You just sent an email successfully and it's just high-fiving you, right? You don't need this, right? And a message that says success is good enough. But that's when you go beyond, right? And you create a memorable experience that people come back to. In this other example, right, this is the Hawaii alert situation.
The
Remember
missile.
the person who should just press the wrong link on a really terrible looking interface where you just have no idea which one's the right one, which one's the wrong one. So imagine if that person that's about to hit that button got this alert message telling them, are you sure you want to send an alert to 303 people telling them a nuclear bomb is about to hit you, or whatever that was, right? And then this is Dropbox, right? This is a pretty basic onboarding carousel experience, right? But adding a little bit of animation to it just makes it so much more sort of consumable and approachable. You just feel like you want to touch it. This is a bit of a narcissistic thing here, but this is our logo on our homepage. And it's ridiculous the amount of people, like we don't really like it that much internally, but it's amazing the amount of people that just tell us in interviews and different places that, oh, I love your logo, how it animates. The reason we don't like it is because you don't end up knowing which one's our logo. But besides from that, it is pretty delightful. You can also use animation and motion to create context. And I think one of the best examples for that, and that's sort of one of the most, let's say, advanced user experiences nowadays, it's Uber, right? So when you open up the app, the first thing you see is a whole bunch of information that otherwise would have been so difficult to communicate, or at least so heavy to communicate. Here you're getting the distance that the drivers are from you. You're understanding if you're going to be able to get a driver fast enough or not, because if there's one close to you, you'll probably get to it pretty quick. And you'll be able to decide whether you can make a decision or not, and all with a glimpse of an eye, right? Just because the screen is in motion. And that's when motion really can, well, yeah, these cars are a bit losing the track there in the park. But this is really sort of a way to crunch down so much heavyweight information into sort of bit-sized information that's so easy to digest. Swear to God, pressing the same button. It didn't change my behavior or anything. But what happens when it's used wrong, right? Because that also happens, and you'll see what ends up happening. So in this example, the user simply asks for his bill, or her bill, right? And it's taking 3.5 seconds to get the bill. Is this animation adding value, or is it just way too slow and it's sort of becoming more cumbersome than actually helping? This is another example where motion is used in a counterintuitive way. So I don't know about you guys, but I don't know many things that start in this fashion, position, and then finish here. So, again, maybe it's to create a bit of tension and capture attention, but at the same time, is this really sort of simulating a natural movement that you'd feel proximity to? Or is it more disrupting? And then at the end, one thing to really consider when we're animating is sort of people with lower faculties, like people with dyslexia or not dyslexia, or epilepsy, right, and so on. So look at this sort of animation, or people that have seasickness or just dizziness, right? I mean, I don't have any of these things and I get dizzy looking at this thing. Right, so also being mindful about how we use animation and when, and if it's really necessary, is also key in understanding what kind of purpose we're accomplishing in animating. So these are a few examples for purpose, or for why, right? Focus, guidance and teaching, feedback, delight and context. And it doesn't stop there, right? You need to define your own purpose and understand whether animation makes sense or not. But animation is a lot more than just the purpose, right? There's also the who, the personality, as well as the execution, the how. And if you look at this screen here, so this animation on the left is just somebody flipping pages in a digital way, right? And on the right-hand side, it's iBook's execution of it. Right? Of course, you can easily say that this is more natural and it sort of feels more like you would actually flip a page. But what it's also saying is, one, that the guys that work there spend way more time on this and execute way better. But it also says that they're trying to deliver some kind of brand value, right? And this is Apple, right? You look at this and you're like, yeah, this is Apple, because that's what they do. They take physical, natural movements from the world and they bring them into their products. And that's why we love Apple so much, because they do stuff like that. And it really helps you define your identity, who you are. I mean, maybe Issue wants to define themselves as a more sort of pragmatic, straight-cut product, and that's totally fine, right? But I think just considering all these notions, the sort of the why, the how, and the when, really helps making the sort of informed decisions on how to drive your animation practice forward. Let's try it again. Define where it makes sense to use them. Animation is not always great to use, and I think an easy way to understand whether your animation will make sense or not is first define your purpose, let's say guidance, and then ask yourself, if I want to solve this problem, or if I want to improve that experience, is adding animation to this guidance principle going to help me fulfill that? If you say yes to that, that's great. And if you say yes to, I can also execute on it in a simple and clear way, then just go for it. Well, I guess that's the last slide, but... And that's it. Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Please.
How would you test if an animation brings value to the product?
And that's a great question. I think the classic ways of testing, so whether it's remote testing or sort of in-person testing, direct interviews with real people, I think is a great way to do it. And what's nice about motion and animation is that you don't really need to ask much about it, because it's going to be so obvious. If you just ask somebody, if you put an animation in front of somebody and you tell them, what do you think about the product? In most likelihood, they're just going to comment on the thing that's moving first, and then talk about all the other stuff. So because it's just, as we said earlier on, it's so ingrained in our DNA and just how we work and how we think, that it'll capture your attention very quickly. And if you want to test different animations, just put the product in front of a person and ask them what's easier. Or if you're trying to solve for easiness, ask them what's easier. And then you'll know which one you have to go to and which one not to. And if you're not sure whether you should have animation at all or not, or yes. Put a product in front of the user, one with animation, one without, and then see how they react. If they find the one that doesn't have animation better, then either you're not doing it right, or that they don't care about it. Either way, you don't need it.
Maybe one more question regarding communication between designers and your techies here,
Yes.
who are developing this when it comes to the how do you execute this. You showed the example from Apple when you swipe the pages.
Right.
How do you sell the idea of making these kind of fancy animations, which we designers obviously love, to your developers to really put time onto this and do that stuff?
Right. I think that's another great question, because very often when we're developing products, you've got a full backlog, right? And there's always something more important to do than to do this little funny animation you did over the weekend. So I think one way to approach it is to be able to communicate its value and to be able to show people why it's actually gonna improve the experience. Now, as we saw, there's some examples like the MailChimp examples, right, where it's not improving the experience, right? It's not going to actually make the product better, but what it's going to do is it's going to make you remember it. So there's all these intangible and hard to track factors that animation and a lot of UX sort of refinements and polish bring to the product that are sort of invisible to product owners or technologists or even sometimes designers. And it is a hard sell. But I would say the best way to try and convince them is to just have them try it, prototype it, put it in front of them, and then ask them, challenge them. Do you think this is going to make people like our product more or not? And everybody wants their product to be more liked because it drives retention, it drives people talking about it, and so on and so forth.
So, what's your favorite prototyping tool?
So we use a little bit of Framer. We use I don't consider Adobe After Effects as a prototyping tool. We use InVision, which is a lot more basic.
Yeah.
I think my favorite tool is the one that helps me create the highest fidelity.
Yeah. So are you also planning, I don't know, to go deeper into Framer.js, so that also, I don't know, the designers get a deeper understanding of the code and stuff like this, and maybe have a better conversations with the techies?
So I think the more you know about code, I think that knowing a little bit of code, just enough to prototype certain things with Framer and so on, is really valid. Especially that Framer is now working on developing a library tool where you can actually create your entire UI library inside Framer. And what that ends up doing is you've got your entire UI library that's built in code that the developers can just drag and drop into the platform right away. So they've got all the CSS, all the drop shadows, all the stuff they need, and they don't even need to use InVision and sort of go and do some copy pasting or whatnot. They just have it there in code.
And also that you can get all these live data, I don't know, directly into your prototype.
Absolutely.
Like Deliveroo did a lot of stuff like this, I don't know, and you were very quick at that.
Then you can do like almost a real-time prototype like the Uber one, right? If you know enough code, then you can definitely do that. And I think even there's developers using Framer now, because they can also prototype things way faster, and they don't have to break any sort of release cycle or take away some branch from other developers or whatever it is, right? And they can just sort of do it in their own little bubble. And yeah, people are doing this now. Cool. So I guess it's pizza time. And please, we can talk further and discuss whatever you want. And feel free to just hang around. I think we've ordered pizza for way more people than we are, so we can really...
Okay.